The day Mrs. Parmenter read the inheritance letter aloud, every child in the hallway pressed their faces to the glass to watch. Not to celebrate with me, to laugh. The McDowell County Home for Children had a window between the superintendent's office and the main corridor, so she could watch us, we always assumed. But that morning, we discovered it worked both ways. I stood in front of her desk in my patched dress and cracked boots, and behind me, through that window, I could hear them. Not quiet laughter, not polite hand-over-mouth laughter, but the full, ugly kind that comes from children who have learned cruelty from the adults who were supposed to protect them. Mrs. Parmenter, thin-lipped, with iron-gray hair pulled so tight it raised her eyebrows into a permanent expression of suspicion, folded the letter from the county clerk, set it on her desk, and looked at me the way she always looked at us. Like we were problems to be processed. "Well, Miss Fossey," she said, "it seems your grandmother's last gift to the world was a 12-acre joke." She paused, let the laughter from the hallway swell and fade. "I suppose madness runs in families." I was 16 years old. I had $2.35 in my pocket, a carpet bag with one change of clothes, and my father's pocket watch that hadn't worked since he died screaming of a burst appendix when I was 7. My mother remarried a railroad man who tolerated me for 18 months after she died of influenza, then pinned a note to my coat and put me on a train back to McDowell County like I was a parcel being returned. 4 months with my mother's cousin Eula, who found my reading uppity and my questions exhausting. 7 months with the Dorsets, who needed a girl to wash their dishes, but not one who had opinions about anything. 6 months in this home, where I learned to be invisible and read every donated book twice. 3 months with the Pews, who took in children for the county stipend and fed us the scraps from their own children's plates. The Poogs had told me that morning not to bother coming back after the reading. Whatever I'd inherited, it was my problem now. What I'd inherited was 12 acres of rocky slope in the high Alleghenies, too steep to farm, too rocky to graze, too logged out for timber. The cabin had collapsed 4 winters ago under the weight of snow and neglect. The well was frozen. The outhouse was a pile of boards, and somewhere on the property, sealed behind a rockfall, was a cave that a county surveyor had once declared filled with poison air and marked as dangerous. The whole county called it the Foss Hole. Some called it Marin's Folly. My grandmother, the woman I'd never met, the woman my mother called Mountain Touched, in a voice that meant crazy, had bought it at a tax auction in 1893 for $11. No one else had bid. She'd lived there alone for 31 years, and when she died frozen in her bed, it took 3 weeks for anyone to notice the chimney had stopped smoking. The children in the hallway were still laughing. Mrs. Parmenter was waiting for me to cry, or beg, or ask to stay. But when she said my grandmother's name, Marin Foss, something happened inside me that I didn't expect. I thought about a woman who chose to live alone on a ridge for 3 decades while an entire county whispered about her. A woman who saw something in 12 acres of rock that no one else could see. A woman who died without ever explaining herself to anyone. Something lit up, not a match, a furnace. And I knew, standing there in that office with children laughing behind glass and a superintendent waiting for me to break, that I was going to find out what she saw. If you want to find out what I discovered on that frozen ridge in West Virginia, how a 16-year-old orphan with nothing but a broken pocket watch and $2 turned a collapsed cabin and a sealed cave into something that saved an entire valley, then subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what my grandmother built in that darkness, what she kept hidden for 31 years while they called her mad, is a story that still lives in those mountains today. I left 3 days later. Mrs. Parmenter didn't try to stop me. I think she was relieved to close the file. The wagon driver I hired with my last 50 cents was a man named Jessup, who smelled like tobacco and didn't talk. He drove me 4 miles out of Bramwell on the wagon road, past the coal company houses and the tipple and the cemetery where miners were buried 3 deep, until the road turned to mud, and the mud turned to something worse. Then he stopped the wagon and pointed. "Deer path starts there," he said. "2 miles up. You'll see the chimney before you see anything else." "You won't take me further?" "Horse won't go." He looked at me, a 16-year-old girl in a patched dress, holding a carpet bag and nothing else. You sure about this? I wasn't sure about anything, but I climbed down from the wagon and started walking. The path was barely a path at all, just a track beaten into the snow by deer and the occasional hunter, winding up through black oak and hemlock toward a ridge I couldn't yet see. The snow was knee-deep in places, crusted hard on top, so it would hold my weight for one step, then collapse without warning and swallow my leg to the thigh. I fell twice in the first quarter mile. The third time I fell, I stayed down for a long minute, staring up at the gray sky through the bare branches, and thought about how easy it would be to just lie here until the cold took me. I got up, I kept walking. The trees changed as I climbed. The oaks gave way to hemlocks, the hemlocks to bare rock and scrub pine. The wind picked up, coming off the ridge in gusts that cut through my coat like it wasn't there. I could feel my ears going numb, then my nose, then my fingers even through my gloves. My carpetbag grew heavier with every step. My father's pocket watch, the one that hadn't worked since he died, knocked against my hip like a heartbeat. By the time I saw the chimney, I was soaked to the waist and shaking so hard I could hear my own teeth. The chimney was all that stood upright. Where the cabin should have been, there was a pile of rotted logs, collapsed under the weight of 4 winters' worth of snow and neglect. The roof had caved in completely, pulling the walls down with it. Glass from the windows lay scattered across the slope, catching the gray afternoon light like pieces of ice. The front door was a splintered ruin, still hanging from one hinge, pointing at nothing. Beyond the cabin, what was left of it, the outhouse was a heap of boards. The well was a frozen hole with a broken winch. A rusted stove lay on its side in the wreckage, cracked straight through the middle. And beyond all of it, the cliff rose straight up into the clouds. Ridgeback Cliff, they called it. A wall of limestone so sheer and high it looked like God had cut it with a knife and walked away. I stood there for a long time. The wind came off the ridge and hit me like a hand. Snow started falling, not heavy, just a thin scatter of flakes that melted on my cheeks and froze in my eyelashes. From where I stood, I couldn't see a single sign of human life. No smoke from another chimney, no light in any window, nothing but rock and snow and trees and the sound of my own breathing. I thought about Jessup, probably back in Bramwell by now, warming himself by a fire, telling someone about the crazy Foss girl he'd driven up to die. I thought about Mrs. Parmenter in her warm office, filing my paperwork, already forgetting my name. I thought about the Pews, who would be sitting down to supper right now, watery soup and old bread, but warm, but inside, but alive. I could walk back. 2 miles to the wagon road, 4 miles to Bramwell. I could tell Mrs. Parmenter she was right. I could apologize in front of the other children. She would place me with another family who needed kitchen help and nothing else, but I would be warm. I would eat. I looked at the collapsed cabin, the frozen well, the 12 acres of rock that everyone in McDowell County called the Fosse Hole. $11 my grandmother had paid for this, at a tax auction where no one else would bid. I didn't turn around. Not because I was brave, I wasn't, but because I had spent my whole life going back to places that didn't want me. The Petersons hadn't wanted me. The Dorsets hadn't wanted me. The Puges had wanted the county stipend, not the girl who came with it. Mrs. Parmenter had never wanted any of us. If I was going to freeze to death, I would freeze to death on something that belonged to me. That first night, I built a lean-to from the cabin wreckage, propped against the one standing chimney for whatever heat the stones still held. I hauled broken furniture out of the collapsed pile, a chair with 3 legs, half a table, pieces of what might have been a bed frame, and stacked them in a ring of stones I'd cleared from the snow. The fire I built was small and smoky and barely warm, but it was mine. I sat with my back against the chimney, wrapped in every piece of clothing I owned, and watched the flames climb into the dark. The cold came anyway. It came through my coat, through my dress, through the wool stockings I'd darned 4 times. It settled into my bones like something with teeth. I fed the fire every hour, then every half hour, burning through the broken furniture faster than I'd expected. By midnight, I was feeding it scraps of bark stripped from fallen branches. By 2 in the morning, I was burning the leather cover of a ruined book I'd found in the wreckage. I woke at 3, shaking so hard my teeth cracked together and couldn't feel my fingers well enough to add more fuel. I managed anyway, holding the sticks between my palms, dropping them onto the coals, blowing until the flames caught again. My breath came out in clouds so thick I could barely see through them. When dawn came, gray and slow, the sun a pale smear behind the clouds, I was still alive. The second day I explored because I couldn't think of anything else to do. The property was 12 acres of nothing, just as Mrs. Parmenter had said. The slope was too steep for farming. You could roll a stone from the cabin site, and it would tumble 100 feet before it stopped. Too rocky for grazing, the limestone pushed up through the thin soil, like bones through skin. Too logged out for timber, whatever trees had been worth cutting were gone 20 years before my grandmother bought the land. The only flat ground was where the cabin had stood, and even that tilted toward the cliff. I walked the boundaries, such as they were, marking the stone cairns that someone, my grandmother, I assumed, had piled to show the property lines. The whole 12 acres took me less than 2 hours to circle, but I wasn't looking at the land. I was looking at the cliff. The rockfall at the base of it, a tumble of limestone boulders stretching maybe 30 feet along the cliff face, looked natural at first glance. Just debris that had fallen from the ridge above, the way rocks do in these mountains, accumulating over decades until they formed a rough pile. But the longer I looked, the more wrong it seemed. The stones were too uniform in size, too deliberately placed, with the larger boulders at the bottom and smaller ones filling the gaps. Some of them had flat faces that couldn't have come from natural fracture. They looked almost cut, almost worked. And the pile itself was too neat, too regular, like someone had stacked it rather than letting it fall. I walked closer. I put my hand on one of the stones. It was loose, not cemented in place by years of frost and thaw, the way natural rockfall would be, just balanced there, waiting to be moved. On the third day, I started moving them. It took me 6 hours. The stones were heavier than they looked. Limestone is dense, and some of these boulders weighed more than I did. I couldn't lift the largest ones, so I levered them with branches, rolling them aside inch by inch. My hands bled through my gloves before noon. My back screamed every time I bent down. I ripped the hem of my dress on a sharp edge and didn't stop to fix it. But by late afternoon, I had cleared enough to see what the rocks were hiding. A fissure in the cliff face. Not a crack, a passage. Wide enough to walk through if you turned sideways. Tall enough that I wouldn't have to duck. And dark. So dark that the afternoon light only penetrated a few feet before giving up. I stood at the entrance and felt air moving. Not a draft exactly. Just a breath of something different, a stillness that had a temperature of its own, cool but not cold, neither damp nor dry. It smelled like stone, like time, like something that had been waiting. I went back to my lean-to and found the candle stub I'd been hoarding, my last one, half burned, saved for emergencies. I thought about saving it longer. I thought about waiting until morning, but I'd already waited 16 years to find something that was mine. I lit the candle and walked into the mountain. The passage ran straight for about 20 feet, narrow enough that my shoulders brushed both walls. The limestone was smooth under my fingers, not rough and fractured like natural cave walls, but worn as if hands had touched it many times. The floor was level. The ceiling was just above my head, and the air was still, so still that my candle flame didn't flicker at all. Then the walls opened up. I stepped out of the passage and into a darkness so vast my candlelight couldn't find the edges. The flame illuminated perhaps 10 feet around me, and beyond that, nothing. Just black. Just space. I could feel the size of it in the way my breathing echoed, in the way the air moved differently, in the way the darkness seemed to swallow the light. I walked forward, one careful step at a time. The floor was smooth limestone, level as a table, stretching out in every direction. The ceiling was somewhere high above me, 20 feet, maybe 30, because when I held my candle up, I couldn't see it. And along the walls, stacked in rows that stretched back into the darkness, were cords of firewood. I stopped walking. I stood there, turning in slow circles, trying to understand what I was seeing. Firewood. Rack after rack of split wood, stacked neat and straight, filling the chamber as far as my light could reach. More wood than I had ever seen in one place. More wood than I could have burned in 10 winters. It was dry. I could tell by the way the light reflected off the split surfaces, by the absence of any mold or dark spots. Some of it had been there so long that dust had settled on the top layers, undisturbed for years. My grandmother had done this. 31 years of hauling wood into this darkness, stacking it against the walls, building something no one else could see or understand. The woman everyone called crazy, the woman who died alone. And there, tucked into a rock shelf at the height of my shoulder, wrapped in oilskin inside a tin box. 14 notebooks. I carried the box back to my lean-to. I sat by my little fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the chimney stones. I unwrapped the oilskin, lifted the lid of the tin box, and took out the first notebook. My grandmother's handwriting, my father's mother, the woman I had never met, who died 4 years before I came to this ridge. April 17th, 1884. I have bought the land, $11 for 12 acres of nothing. They think I am a fool? Perhaps I am. But I have seen what the cave contains, and I have a theory. I read through the night. I read while my fire burned down to coals and my fingers went numb. I read while the stars wheeled overhead and the wind howled against the chimney. I read until the candle guttered out and I had to wait, shaking with cold and something else, for dawn to come so I could keep reading. Marin Fossey, my father's mother. The woman my mother had called mountain-touched, in a voice that meant crazy, that meant stay away, that meant we don't talk about her. The woman who lived alone on this ridge for 31 years while the town whispered about her and laughed at her, and no one ever came to visit. She wasn't crazy. She was brilliant. The notebooks contained 31 years of meticulous observations, temperature readings from inside the cave, taken every month, sometimes every week. 47 degrees in January, 47 degrees in July, 47 degrees in October and March, and every month between. Year after year after year, the same number. The mountain does not care about seasons, she'd written. It holds its warmth in winter and its coolness in summer. I have measured this now for 5 years, and the variation is less than 2 degrees. This is the key to everything. Humidity measurements, lower inside the cave than outside, even in the wettest August. Diagrams of the chamber I'd walked through, with dimensions marked in her careful handwriting. 300 feet long, 60 feet wide, 15 feet high at the center. A crack in the ceiling near the back, providing natural ventilation, marked with an arrow and the note, "Air moves here." The cave breathes, and pages upon pages of calculations about firewood. Oak cut in September, stacked in the cave by October, burns perfectly by the 2nd February, she'd written. The stable temperature cures the wood better than any summer sun. I have tested this. Wood that takes 2 years to dry outside dries in 11 months underground. The mountain keeps what I give it. She had figured out something no one else in the mountains had discovered. Or maybe others had discovered it and hadn't understood what they were seeing. The cave was a vault, a storehouse, a place to keep things safe from weather, from rot, from the mice and insects that destroyed wood piles above ground. And more than that, a place invisible to the neighbors who would steal your fuel while you slept. And they came to the door again, asking where I keep my woodpile. One entry read, from 1903. The Suttons this time. I said nothing. I know what they wanted. They wanted to know so they could come back in the night when their own pile ran low. If they knew, they would take it. If they took it, I would die. Secrecy is survival. Another entry from 1908. Tested the theory again today. Brought up wood from the June stack, now 11 months old, and compared it to wood I left outside in the shed. The cave wood is dry all the way through. The shed wood is still wet at the center, even after 2 summers. The cave wins. It always wins. And another from 1912. They call me the Witch of Ridgeback. I heard Mrs. Shively say it in the general store. She said I burn hellfire to keep warm, that I have made a deal with the devil. I said nothing. Let them think what they think. The devil is not keeping me alive. The mountain is. I read entry after entry, and year after year, watching my grandmother's handwriting change from young and strong to old and trembling, watching her theories become certainties, watching her loneliness deepen with every page. And then, near the end of the final notebook, dated January 2nd, 1915, 9 days before she died, I found the entry that broke me. I am 70 years old. I've kept this secret for 27 years. My hands shake now, and my eyes fail in dim light, and some mornings I cannot rise from bed until the stiffness leaves my bones. I do not fear death, but I wish, how I wish, that I had someone to tell this to. Someone who would understand, someone who would keep the cave alive when I am gone, someone who sees what I see instead of what everyone else sees. I wrote to the county home last summer asking if there were any Foss children. They never answered. Perhaps there are none. Perhaps I am the last of us, and the cave will be lost when I'm lost. But if someone finds these notebooks, if someone reads these words, let them know. I was not mad. I was not a witch. I was just a woman who listened when the mountain spoke. I put the notebook down. I sat on the frozen ground beside my dying fire. 14 notebooks spread around me like offerings, and I cried. Not from the cold, though I was freezing. Not from exhaustion, though I hadn't slept in 2 days. Not from hunger, though my stomach was a hollow ache. I cried because someone like me had come before. Someone who didn't fit, who didn't belong anywhere, who saw things other people couldn't see and got called crazy for seeing them. Someone who had spent her whole life alone with a secret the world refused to understand. She had wanted to tell someone. She had written to the county home, my county home, looking for a Foss child. And no one had answered. Mrs. Parmenter. It must have been Mrs. Parmenter, or someone like her. Throwing away letters from old women on ridges, not worth the paper they were written on. I could have known her. If someone had answered that letter, I could have had 3 months, 6 months, a year with my grandmother before she died. She could have taught me herself. She could have shown me the cave, walked me through the passages, explained everything in person instead of in cramped handwriting on yellowed pages. Instead, she died alone, frozen in her bed, 3 weeks before anyone noticed. I'm here, I said out loud, to the empty ridge, to the dead woman in my blood. I'm here now. You can tell me. The last thing I found was the quote I would carry for the rest of my life. It was written on the first page of the first notebook, in handwriting that was younger and stronger than the trembling script at the end. She must have written it years later, going back to add a title to everything she'd learned. They laughed because I had no woodpile, but I had learned the lesson the mountain teaches. The safest place to keep what you need is where no one thinks to look. I closed the notebook. I stood up, bones aching, eyes swollen, face raw with tears that had frozen on my cheeks. I looked at the collapsed cabin, the frozen well, the 12 acres of rock that everyone in McDowell County called worthless. I was going to finish what she started, but first I had to survive. The notebooks told me what to build. They told me how to build it, detailed diagrams of the hidden door, specifications for the wood racks, calculations showing exactly how many cords would last through the worst winter on record. My grandmother had left me a map. What she hadn't left me was a way to survive long enough to follow it. I had no money. I had no tools. I had no food beyond the handful of dried apples I'd brought from Bramwell, 5 of them, shriveled and brown, and whatever I could dig from the frozen ground. I had a collapsed cabin that let in wind from every direction. I had a well I couldn't draw from until the ice thawed. I had 14 notebooks full of knowledge I couldn't use until I stopped starving. The first week of April, I ate my dried apples. 1 per day, chewed slowly, making each one last as long as I could. I supplemented them with dandelion roots, bitter and fibrous, barely food at all, but the only thing I could find growing through the patchy snow. The second week of April, I caught a rabbit in a snare I'd built from bootlaces and a bent branch. I'd never killed anything larger than a spider. I'd never gutted an animal or skinned one or built a fire hot enough to cook meat. I did all of these things badly, wasting more than I kept, but I ate for 3 days on that rabbit, stewed, roasted over flames, boiled for broth until the bones gave up their last nutrition. The third week of April, I ate nothing but dandelion greens and wild onion, and I started to understand what hunger really meant. It wasn't the pain. The pain faded after a while, settling into a dull ache that became background noise. It was the weakness. The way my hands shook when I tried to lift things. The way my vision narrowed when I stood up too fast. The way I would lose minutes, sometimes hours, sitting and staring at nothing because my mind didn't have the fuel to think. By the third week, I had lost 15 pounds I didn't have to lose. My dress hung off my shoulders like a sack. My hip bones stood out like doorknobs. When I looked at my reflection in the frozen well water, I saw a stranger, gaunt, hollow-eyed, old in a way that had nothing to do with years. I had rebuilt enough of the cabin to sleep inside by then. Not enough to stay warm. The gaps between the logs were still wide enough to put my fist through, and the wind came through them like knives, but enough that I wasn't sleeping in a lean-to anymore. I burned the wood my grandmother had stacked in the cave. There was no other choice. The stack represented 30 years of her labor, and I was burning it just to stay alive long enough to understand what I was burning. Every log felt like a betrayal. Every night, huddled by the fire she had cut and split and hauled and cured, I told her I was sorry. Late April, 3 in the morning, I woke shaking so hard I bit my tongue and tasted blood. The fire had gone out. I couldn't feel my feet. The cold had settled into my chest like something with teeth, something that wanted to drag me down and keep me. I lay there in the dark and thought about Mrs. Parminter's office, the warmth, the lamp on her desk, the coal stove in the corner that kept the whole room comfortable. I thought about the other children watching through the glass, some of them laughing, but at least they were alive, at least they were fed. At least they weren't shaking on a frozen ridge in the middle of nowhere, with no one to hear them if they screamed. I thought about the Pew's kitchen, watery soup and stale bread, but soup, but bread, but a roof that didn't leak, but a fire someone else kept burning. I thought about how easy it would be to walk back down that deer path. I could be in Bramwell by noon. I could tell Mrs. Parminter she was right. I could say, "I'm sorry, I was foolish. The madness does run in families." She would be smug about it. She would make me apologize in front of the other children, but she would let me back in because it was her job to let orphans back in, and I would be warm. I would be warm, and I would be alive, and I would never own anything again as long as I lived. I looked at the shelf I'd built, one rough plank balanced on 2 rocks, where Marin's notebooks sat wrapped in their oilskin. I thought about her at 70, alone on this ridge, hands shaking, eyes failing, still working, still stacking wood in the darkness, still keeping her secret. I thought about that entry. I wish I had someone to tell it to. She had wished for someone like me. She had written to the county home hoping someone would answer, and no one did. And she died alone. I got up. My feet screamed when they touched the cold floor, but I got up. I rebuilt the fire with numb fingers that could barely grip the wood. I blew on the coals until the flames caught. I watched the light climb up the chimney stones, and I thought about my grandmother watching this same light in this same darkness for 31 years. I was not going to let her die twice. I went back to sleep, and in the morning I started again. The land saved me, barely. Early May brought wild ramps, pungent, garlicky greens that grew in the hollows where snow melted first. I found a patch of them on the eastern slope, pushing up through the dead leaves, and I fell to my knees and ate them raw, dirt and all, until my stomach cramped and my eyes watered. They were the best thing I had ever tasted. I found morel mushrooms along a fallen oak, their honeycomb caps perfect and clean, and I cooked them in the cracked skillet I'd salvaged from the cabin wreckage. I found wild leeks by the frozen creek, their white bulbs tender and sharp. I found the first fiddleheads of spring uncurling from the forest floor, and I boiled them until they were soft and ate them like they were treasure. A deer wandered too close to my snare one morning, a young doe, thin from winter, moving slowly through the trees. I killed it with a rock because I had nothing else. I butchered it badly, wasting meat I couldn't carry, but I smoked what I could over a fire I kept burning for 3 days straight. The meat would last me into June if I was careful. My weight stabilized. The shaking stopped. The hollow feeling in my chest filled in, slowly, with something that felt almost like strength. But I was still surviving. I hadn't started the real work yet. The notebooks sat on their shelf, waiting. The cave sat in the darkness, waiting. 40 chords, my grandmother had calculated. 40 chords for the worst winter on record. I had 0. Winter was 8 months away. By June, I had rebuilt the cabin well enough to stop the wind. The gaps were chinked with a mixture of clay and ash that Harlon would later tell me was all wrong, but that held well enough for the summer. The roof was patched with salvaged shingles and tar paper I'd traded for in Bramwell. It leaked when it rained, but it kept the worst of the weather out, and when I built a fire in the cracked stove, the heat actually stayed inside instead of bleeding through the walls. I had also borrowed an axe from the hardware store, 50 cents on credit, payable from my first trade. The shopkeeper, a narrow man named Aldrich with ink-stained fingers and eyes that never quite met yours, looked at me like I was wasting his time. "You're the Foss girl," he said. "Living up in the Foss hole." "I am." "Planning to farm rock?" "No, sir. I'm planning to cut wood." He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Your grandmother cut wood for 30 years and died with nothing to show for it. No woodpile anyone ever saw." "You planning to burn the same hellfire she burned?" "I'm planning to burn oak," I said. "Is the axe for sale or not?" He gave it to me. I think he assumed I'd be dead by winter and he'd get it back anyway. Through June and July and August, I worked harder than I had ever worked in my life. I found standing dead oak on the ridges to the south of my property, trees killed by lightning or disease, already dry enough to burn without seasoning. I felled them with the borrowed axe, learning as I went, figuring out which way a tree would fall by the lean of its trunk, learning to step back fast when the wood started cracking. I limbed them where they lay, cutting off branches until nothing remained but the main trunk. I bucked those trunks into rounds, each one 18 inches long, the length my grandmother's diagram specified for her wood racks, and I split those rounds into pieces small enough to fit in a stove. Each cord took me 40 hours of labor, 40 hours of swinging the axe until my shoulders burned and my hands bled and my whole body shook with exhaustion. I moved the first cord into the cave in late June, then the second, then the third. By the end of July, I had 5 cords stacked against the far wall, right where my grandmother's diagram said they should go. Then my axe handle cracked. I was splitting a stubborn round of red oak, swinging harder than I should have because the grain was twisted and wouldn't give. I heard the crack before I felt it, a sharp sound like a branch breaking. The axe head flew off the handle and buried itself in the dirt 2 feet away. I stood there, holding the broken hickory, and felt something inside me crack too. I had no money for a new handle. I had nothing to trade that Aldrich would want. I was still working off the 50 cents I owed him, 1 load of smoked venison at a time, and the credit he'd extended was already more than his patience could stand. Winter was 4 months away. I needed 40 cords according to my grandmother's calculations, and I had 5. I could not cut 35 more cords in 4 months, but I might cut 20. Might cut enough to survive if the winter was mild, but not without an axe. I sat down on a stump and cried, for exactly 1 minute. Then I stopped. Crying wasn't going to fix the axe. The church in Bramwell had a lending library, 2 shelves of donated books in the back room that nobody wanted, dog-eared and water-stained and missing pages. I'd already read most of them during my time at the home, but one of them was a pamphlet on farm tool repair, and in the back of that pamphlet, past the sections on sharpening plowshares and mending harnesses, was a diagram of how to carve an axe handle from a hickory blank. I found a hickory branch thick enough to work with. I borrowed a draw knife from Harlon, though I didn't know him yet as Harlon, just as the one-handed man who lived in the valley and sometimes appeared at the edge of my property line, watching, and I started carving. It took me 3 days. My hands blistered, burst, and blistered again. The handle I made was ugly, rough, and uneven, sized more by desperation than measurement, with a curve that wasn't quite right. But when I fitted it to the axe head and drove the wedge home with a mallet I'd made from a round of oak, it held. Barely, but it held. I went back to work. Late September, 1919. I walked into the cave to stack a new load of wood, 4 rounds of split oak balanced in my arms, and noticed something I hadn't noticed before. The wood I'd placed in June, 3 months earlier, was different. I set down my load and walked to the June stack. I picked up a split log and felt its weight in my hands. Lighter. Much lighter than I remembered. The wood had been heavy when I'd carried it in, dense with moisture even though it came from a standing dead tree. Now it felt almost hollow. I turned it in my hands. I smelled it. No dampness, no hint of the musty smell that green wood carries. The split face was pale and dry, the grain clearly visible, the surface almost dusty. I struck it against another log and heard the sound, a clean, solid ring, like a bell, like the sound wood makes when all the water is gone, when there's nothing left but fiber and air. The cave was doing exactly what my grandmother said it would. I sat down on the cave floor holding that dry log and laughed, really laughed, for the first time since I'd arrived on this ridge. The sound echoed off the walls and came back to me, and I laughed again at the echo. And then I was crying, but these tears were different. These tears felt earned. "You were right," I said to the darkness, to the woman who had figured this out decades before I was born. "You were right about everything. The stable temperature, the low humidity, the constant dark. They were curing the wood faster and more completely than anything outside could manage. Wood that would take 2 summers to dry in the open air was ready in 11 months underground. I had 12 cords in the cave by then, 28 more to go before I reached my grandmother's target. Winter was coming. I could feel it in the mornings, the frost that lingered longer, the way the light came later and left earlier. I wasn't ready. Not for a bad winter, not for the kind of winter that killed people on ridges like this. But the system worked. The cave worked. For the first time since I'd arrived on this 12-acre joke, I believed I might actually survive. That was when Harlon Wixs walked up the deer path with a toolbox in his one good hand. I was outside splitting what remained of a dead oak when I heard him coming. The sound of boots on the path, steady and unhurried. I raised the axe and held it ready. A girl alone on a ridge learns to be careful about who walks out of the trees. But he stopped at the edge of the clearing and held up his hand. His right hand. The other arm ended at the wrist, a clean amputation that had healed into a smooth stump years ago. He was lean and weathered, with a face like crumpled paper and eyes the pale blue of winter sky. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. His voice was rougher than I expected, gravel in it, and something else. Kindness, maybe, or just exhaustion. "Name's Harlon Wixs. I promised your grandmother I'd keep an eye on this place." He looked around, at the rebuilt cabin, at the cleared land, at the woodpile that wasn't supposed to exist. Took me a while to realize someone was here to keep an eye on. He was 68 years old, though I didn't know that then, a retired coal miner who'd lost his hand in a roof collapse 17 years before. He'd known my grandmother for 20 years, longer than I'd been alive. "You knew her," I said. It wasn't a question. 20 years. Played checkers on her porch most summer evenings. She beat me more often than not." He smiled, and the smile changed his whole face, made him younger somehow, or at least less tired. "I helped her fix that roof twice, helped her haul timbers when she was building the racks in the—" He stopped, looked at me more carefully. "You found it," he said. "The cave. I found it. And the notebooks. 14 of them." He nodded slowly. He didn't seem surprised. "She told me once, near the end, she said, 'Harlon, when I'm gone, someone's going to find what I built. I hope they're smart enough to understand it.'" He looked at me, really looked, the way no one had looked at me since my mother died. "I think she meant you." He stayed for 3 hours that first day. He looked at my cabin repairs and told me which ones would hold and which would fail by December. He showed me how to chink the gaps properly with a mix of clay and stite ash that would harden against the cold rather than crumble. He saw the cave for only the second time in his life and walked the length of it in silence. When he came back out into the afternoon light, he touched the dry wood with his one hand, lifted a log from the June stack, smelled it, set it down. I knew she wasn't crazy, he said quietly. I just didn't know how right she was. Before he left, he turned back to me. His eyes were wet, though he didn't seem to notice. Your grandmother used to say something. She said the mountain would tell her secrets to whoever was willing to listen. He smiled again, smaller this time, sadder. Looks like it found someone. I watched him walk back down the deer path until the trees swallowed him up. Then I stood there for a long while, looking at the cave mouth, at the cabin, at the 12 acres of rock that everyone said were worthless. I wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in 5 years, I had someone who believed in me. I didn't know yet how much I would come to depend on him. I didn't know that his body was already failing, that the mines had taken more than just his hand. I didn't know how little time we had. But standing there in the September light, with 12 cords in the cave and a friend in the valley, and a winter I might actually survive, I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a child. I felt hope. The cave was working. The wood was curing. Winter was coming. But the real test hadn't come yet. Harlon came back 3 days later, and the day after that, and the day after that. He never announced himself, never asked permission. He just appeared at the edge of the clearing with his toolbox, nodded at whatever I was doing, and started working on something else. The first week he rebuilt my cabin door, the one I'd hung myself, which stuck in the frame and let in drafts around the edges. He planed it down with a hand plane he operated one-handed, bracing the wood against his body in a way that made the missing hand irrelevant. You learn to adapt, he said when he caught me watching. The mines take something from everyone. Some men, it takes their lungs. Some men, it takes their backs. Took my hand. Could have been worse. What could have been worse? Could have taken my life. Took my son's life in a different way. Thomas went to France in 17. Didn't come back. He said it flat, the way you say things that have been true so long they've worn smooth. My wife Emma died the same year your mother did. The influenza. We'd been married 41 years. He went back to planing the door. I went back to splitting wood. Neither of us said anything else for an hour, but the silence felt different than it had before. It felt like company. By October, Harlon had taught me more than I'd learned in 16 years of other people's houses. He showed me how to build wood racks that would hold weight without sagging. The trick was in the joinery, mortise, and tenon, no nails to rust and fail. He showed me how to reinforce the cave entrance with a timber frame that would last 100 years. He showed me how to construct the hidden door my grandmother had designed, built into the back wall of the cabin so that it looked like a closet from the inside and like nothing at all from the outside. Marin showed me this once, he said, running his hand along the doorframe. Just once. Made me swear I'd never tell anyone. I asked her why she needed a secret door. He smiled, that sad smile that creased his whole face. She said, Harlon, you know what people are like when they're cold and scared. They take what they need. I don't blame them for it, but I won't die for it either. He taught me how to read the weather by the way the clouds moved over the ridge, by the behavior of the birds, by the ache in his missing hand that came before every storm. He taught me which trees to cut and which to leave, how to find standing dead wood by the color of the bark, how to tell dry rot from solid heartwood with a single knock. And in exchange, I read him my grandmother's notebooks. His eyes weren't what they'd been. The mines had taken some of that too, years of working in dim light. So I read aloud while he worked, and he listened. Sometimes he'd stop what he was doing when I reached a passage that moved him. Sometimes he'd laugh at something she'd written, some observation about the neighbors or the weather or her own stubbornness. She was something, he said once. Marin Fossey, toughest woman I ever knew, and the loneliest. Did she ever talk about family? Once or twice, said she had a son who moved away, married a woman who didn't like mountains, said she had a granddaughter somewhere she'd never met. He looked at me. I think she meant you. I didn't know what to say to that, so I kept reading. The first winter came hard and fast. November brought snow that didn't melt. December brought cold that cracked the water in the well bucket overnight. I burned 4 cords of wood that winter, 1 cord per month from December through March, and watched my grandmother's calculations prove themselves true. The cabin stayed warm, the cave stayed steady at 47 degrees. The wood I pulled from the racks in January was as dry and ready as the wood I'd stacked in June. I survived. But survival wasn't the same as success. I'd entered the winter with only 16 cords, less than half what my grandmother recommended, and I'd burned through a quarter of my supply in 1 season. At that rate, I had 3 more winters before I ran out. Not enough margin, not enough safety. 1 bad year, 1 long cold snap, 1 mistake, and I'd be right back where I started. So when the snow melted and the deer path opened up again, I went back to work. Spring of 1920. I cut wood from dawn to dusk, every day the weather allowed. My hands, which had blistered and bled the year before, were hard now, calloused so thick I could grip a hot pan without flinching. My shoulders, which had screamed at every swing, were roped with muscle that didn't come from being 16. I didn't look like a girl anymore. I looked like someone who worked. Harlon helped when he could. His cough had gotten worse over the winter, deep and wet, the kind of cough that came from lungs full of coal dust, and some days he couldn't make the walk up from his cabin. But when he came ready to work. He built me a proper sawbuck for cutting rounds. He showed me how to use a wedge and sledge to split the stubborn pieces, the ones with twisted grain that the axe couldn't handle. By June, I had 24 cords in the cave. By August, 32. By October, when the first frost painted the ridge white, I had 40. 40 cords of split oak, stacked in neat rows along the walls of the cave, stretching back into the darkness like a library of heat. Enough for 3 winters, my grandmother had calculated. Enough to survive anything the mountain could throw at me. I stood at the entrance of the cave that October evening, looking at what I'd built, and I felt something I didn't have a word for. Not pride, exactly, not satisfaction. Something deeper, something that felt like my grandmother standing beside me, her hand on my shoulder, saying, "You understand now. You see what I saw." 40 cords, Harlon said. He'd come up the path without my hearing him, moving quiet the way old hunters do. She'd be proud of you. She'd tell me 40 isn't enough, I said. She'd tell me to cut 40 more. He laughed, and the laugh turned into a cough, and the cough went on long enough that I started toward him, but he waved me off. She would, he agreed, when he could speak again. Marin always said the only safe number was 1 more than you had. We stood there in the fading light, watching the shadows lengthen across the ridge. "Harlon," I said, "what's wrong with your lungs?" He didn't answer for a long time. When he did, his voice was quiet. "Black lung. Had it for years. It's getting worse." He looked at me, that clear, steady gaze that never flinched from hard things. "I've got time yet, but not forever. Nobody gets forever." I wanted to say something. I wanted to tell him he couldn't leave me. Not after everything. Not when he was the only person in the world who understood. But I didn't say any of that. I just stood beside him, watching the light die, feeling the cold come in. "The cave is full," I said finally. "Whatever happens now, the cave is full." "The cave is full," he agreed. "But the real test hasn't come. It never has, in all the years I've known this ridge. Your grandmother never faced a truly bad winter, not the kind that kills. If one comes..." He trailed off. "Then we'll find out if she was right." Then we'll find out. I went to Bramwell twice a month that fall to trade. I had smoked venison from the deer I'd taken in September. I had herbs I'd dried, mint and chamomile and yarrow, that the women in town bought for teas and poultices. I had reputation, too, though not the kind I wanted. The Foss girl. The one who lived in the Foss hole. The one who burned the same hellfire her grandmother burned. The confrontation I'd been dreading came on a Tuesday in late September in the general store while I was buying salt. Opal Shively was there. I'd seen her before, a widow about 60, with a face like a hatchet and a voice that carried across any room she entered. She ran the egg and butter trade from her farm south of town, and she ran the gossip trade too, collecting and distributing rumors with equal efficiency. She saw me at the counter and her eyes narrowed. "Well," she said, loud enough for everyone in the store to hear, "if it isn't the Foss girl. Living up in that witch hole, aren't you? Burning the same hellfire your grandmother burned?" I set my coins on the counter. I didn't look at her. "I asked you a question, girl." I looked at her then. She was standing by the pickle barrel, arms crossed, chin lifted. 3 other women had stopped what they were doing to watch. The shopkeeper, Aldrich, was pretending to organize something behind the counter. "I burn oak, ma'am," I said. "Cured 2 years. It doesn't smell like much of anything." "Your grandmother never had a wood pile, 30 years on that ridge and not a single stick of wood where anyone could see it. Reverend Carlyle says the devil provides for his own." "Reverend Carlyle is welcome to visit my property and inspect my woodpile anytime he likes." I picked up my salt, tucked it into my bag. "The path is steep, though. He might want to wear sturdy boots." I walked out of the store. Behind me I heard Opal Shively's voice rising, but I didn't turn around. Carlson Tate came in June. I'd heard his name before everyone in McDowell County had. He owned the Tate Coal and Lumber Company, which held timber rights on most of the ridges in the county. He'd tried to buy my grandmother's land 3 times while she was alive, and she'd refused him every time. He arrived in a motor car, one of only 3 in the county, with 2 men who looked like they worked for him in ways that didn't involve timber. I was splitting wood in the clearing when the engine noise came up the path, a sound so foreign to this ridge that I thought at first it was thunder. The car stopped at the edge of my property. Tate climbed out. He was shorter than I'd expected, soft around the middle, with the pale indoor skin of a man who made his money from other people's labor. His suit was too fine for these mountains, wool that would snag on every branch, shoes that would be ruined in the first mud puddle. "Miss Fossey," he said, "I'm Carlson Tate. I believe you know who I am." "I know who you are." "Good. Then we can skip the pleasantries." He looked around at the rebuilt cabin, at the cleared land, at the stack of wood drying in the sun. "I'll give you $50 for this property, cash, today." $50 was more money than I'd seen in my life. $50 was a year's wages for a working man. $50 was enough to buy a train ticket anywhere, to start over somewhere warm, to never shiver through another mountain winter. "No," I said. His expression didn't change. 60. "No." "Miss Fossey?" He took a step toward me, and his voice changed, got quieter, got sharper. "I came up here last February to see if you'd frozen to death. Everyone said you would. No woodpile, no supplies, no experience. A girl alone on a ridge where grown men have died." He looked at my woodpile, at my cabin, at the axe in my hands. "You weren't dead. I want to know how. Who's been supplying you?" "No one supplies me, Mr. Tate. I supply myself." "That's impossible. I've had men watch this property. No wagons come up here. No one brings you wood." "Then your men aren't watching carefully enough." His face reddened. "You're lying. Someone is helping you, and I want to know who. Tell me, and I won't pursue the tax lien I've asked the county to place on this property." I leaned on my axe. "You can pursue whatever you like. Mr. Tate, I'll pay the tax lien when it comes due. This land is mine. It was my grandmother's before me, and it's not for sale." He stared at me for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to his motor car without another word. His men followed him. The engine started. The car backed down the path, and I listened to the sound of it fade until the ridge was quiet again. I stood there leaning on my axe and realized my hands were shaking, not from fear, from something else, from power. The summer of 1920 was warm and dry. The wells in Bramwell ran steady. The creeks stayed full. It was the kind of summer that made people careless, that made them think winters would always be mild and water would always flow. I didn't think that. I'd read my grandmother's notebooks. I knew what she knew, that the good years made people forget, and the bad years taught them again. In August, a man came up the deer path wearing city clothes and carrying a leather satchel full of papers. Dr. Samuel Poole, he said his name was, professor of agricultural science at West Virginia University. He'd heard about the woman on the ridge with the secret woodpile, and he wanted to see if the rumors were true. I showed him the cave. He spent 3 hours inside, measuring temperatures, examining the wood, taking notes in a little book he carried. When he came out, his face was strange, half amazed, half angry. "Miss Fossey," he said, "this is remarkable. Your grandmother understood principles that we're only just beginning to teach in university classrooms: thermal mass, humidity control, curing environments. She figured all of this out by observation, by experiment, by decades of careful attention." He shook his head. "Why doesn't anyone in this county know what you've built here?" "They know," I said. "They just don't believe it." He wrote about my grandmother's system in a government pamphlet that was published the following year. The Foss Method, he called it. He gave her credit by name: Marin Fossey, pioneer of underground fuel storage. He connected me with the county extension office, which began recommending cave storage to other families in the highlands. But all of that came later. That summer, all I knew was that someone with letters after his name had looked at what my grandmother built and said it was real, said it was right, said it was remarkable. I stood at the entrance of the cave that evening and spoke to her, the way I'd gotten used to doing. "They're starting to believe," I said. "It's slow, but they're starting." The cave didn't answer, but I felt something, a warmth, a presence, something that might have been nothing but might have been her. October came. The leaves turned and fell. The first frost painted the ridge white. I had 40 cords in the cave. I was ready for anything. I didn't know yet that the worst was coming. The first storm hit on November 23rd, 1920. I remember the date because it was 2 days before Thanksgiving, and I'd been planning to walk down to Harlon's cabin with a haunch of venison and a jar of preserved apples. I woke that morning to a sky the color of iron, and by noon the snow was falling so thick I couldn't see the cave entrance from my cabin door. 3 feet fell in 18 hours. The temperature dropped behind the snow, 15 degrees below zero, then 20. The wind came off the ridge in gusts that shook the cabin walls. I fed my stove every 2 hours, burning through wood faster than I'd planned, and still the cold crept in around the edges. I'd seen hard winters before. This was something else. The second storm hit 4 days later, before anyone had finished digging out from the first. Another 2 feet of snow. The deer path to Bramwell disappeared completely, buried under drifts that came up to my waist in places, higher in others. I couldn't get down the mountain even if I'd wanted to. And it kept coming. Storm after storm through December, through January, through February. The kind of winter my grandmother had written about in her notebooks. The kind she'd calculated for. The kind that killed. The community's conventional systems began to fail one by one. The Dorset family, the same Dorsets who'd taken me in for 7 months when I was 12, who'd needed kitchen help but not opinions, ran out of firewood by Christmas. I heard later that they burned their kitchen table first, then the chairs, then the bed frames. Their youngest boy, Thomas, nearly died of hypothermia on New Year's Eve. A neighbor shared their dwindling supply, but it wasn't enough. The Poog family, the ones who'd fed me scraps for the county stipend, started rationing in January. 6 people in a 2-room cabin, burning a quarter of what they needed to stay warm, crowding together under every blanket they owned. The McDowell County Home for Children lost heat entirely for 4 days in early January. The boiler had run dry of coal, and no deliveries could get through the blocked roads. Mrs. Pariner had the children sleep 3 to a bed under every blanket the home possessed. 2 of the youngest got frostbite on their fingers. None of them died, but it was close. Carlson Tate's lumber depot, the one where people bought their firewood, the one he'd been selling from all fall instead of stockpiling, was emptied by desperate buyers in the first week. Then it was picked clean by thieves who didn't bother buying. 2 elderly miners in company housing froze to death. They found the first one in his chair by the window, frozen solid, a cup of coffee still in his hand. They found the second one in bed covers pulled up to his chin like he'd just decided to sleep a little longer. And through all of it, my cave held steady. 40 cords of split oak, perfectly cured, dry and ready. 47 degrees, winter and summer, year after year after year. I could have burned 3 cords a month and still had wood left over when spring came. The system my grandmother designed wasn't just working, it was thriving. The mountain didn't care about storms or cold, or the desperation of the people outside it. The mountain just kept what it was given. The worst moment came in early January. I hadn't seen Harlon in 3 weeks. The path between his cabin and mine was buried under 4 feet of snow, and his cough had been so bad the last time I'd seen him that I was afraid to make him walk it. But I couldn't stop thinking about him alone down there, with his one hand and his bad lungs and his small woodpile that hadn't been big enough to start with. I put on every piece of clothing I owned and started walking. It took me 4 hours to cover 2 miles. The snow was up to my hips in places. I fell through a hidden drift and spent 20 minutes digging myself out, shaking so hard I could barely grip the branches I used to pull myself free. By the time I reached Harlan's cabin, I was so cold I couldn't feel my face. The chimney wasn't smoking. I found him inside, huddled under every blanket he owned, shaking with cold. His woodpile was empty. His stove was dead. His breath came out in clouds that hung in the air. "Should have told you," he managed through chattering teeth. "Didn't want to worry you." I got him up. I got him dressed. I half carried him back up the deer path to my cabin, which took another 5 hours because he couldn't walk properly, and I had to stop every 100 feet to rest. By the time we reached my door, it was dark, and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. I put him in my bed. I built up the fire until the cabin was warm enough to hurt. I made him drink hot water with honey until the shaking stopped and his eyes focused again. "You could have died," I said. "So could you, coming to get me. You're my friend, Harlon. You're the only friend I have." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Your grandmother would have come for me too. Did once, back in '98. Found me half frozen in a drift a quarter mile from my own cabin. Dragged me back, same as you did. Saved my life." "She never wrote about that in the notebooks." "No, she wouldn't have. Marin wasn't one for talking about kindness. She just did it." He stayed with me for the rest of the winter. I gave him the bed. I slept on a pallet by the fire. We burned through my supply at twice the rate I'd planned, 2 people, 2 months of cold, but I had 40 cords, and 40 cords was enough. We survived. But across the valley, people were dying. People were freezing. People were burning their furniture and their fences and their hope, and they were about to find out where my grandmother kept her wood. The first person to come was Mr. Pugh. He appeared at my door on a Thursday afternoon in January, after the worst of the storms had passed, but before the road had opened up again. He must have walked 3 miles through waist-deep snow to reach me. His face was red with cold, and his hat was in his hands. I recognized him instantly, the same narrow face, the same way of not quite meeting your eyes, the same voice I remembered from 3 years of watery soup and cold corners. "Miss Fossey," he said. He swallowed. "Do you have anything to spare?" "For the children. They're cold." I looked at him. This man who had taken me in for the county stipend and fed me the scraps from his own children's plates, who had made me sleep in the coldest corner of the house because I wasn't family, who had never once asked me what I wanted or who I was or what I dreamed about. He was shaking, not from cold, from something else. Shame, maybe, or desperation. "Wait here," I said. I went to the back of the cabin. I opened the hidden door, the one Harlon and I had built together, the one that looked like a closet but led to the cave. I walked into the darkness, to the racks along the nearest wall, and I gathered an armful of wood. When I came back, Poog's eyes went wide. "Take it," I said. "Bring your wagon back for more if you need it." He stared at the wood, at the door behind me, at me. How do you? "It doesn't matter how. What matters is that you have children who are cold. Take the wood, Mr. Pugh." He took it. He loaded it into a sled he dragged up the mountain, and he went back down the path without another word. He came back 2 days later with his wife. I gave them another cord. The Dorsets came the day after that. The same Dorsets who'd needed kitchen help but not opinions. I gave them a full cord without asking for anything in return. Mrs. Dorset cried when she saw it, actually stood in my doorway and wept while her husband loaded the sled. "Thank you," she said. Thank you, we didn't know, we never thought." It's all right, I said. Go home. Keep your children warm. Then the Shivleys came, Opal's son-in-law, hat in hand, asking for fuel the same way Pooji had asked. I gave him a full cord. He didn't thank me. He didn't apologize for his mother-in-law's words in the general store. He just took the wood and left. I didn't care. The wood didn't care who burned it. Word spread the way word always spreads in small communities, quickly, quietly, through back doors and whispered conversations. The Fosse girl has wood. The Fosse girl has more wood than she needs. The Fosse girl is giving it away. By the end of January, I had given fuel to 11 different families. My 40 cords had become 33. It was still enough. It would always have been enough. Harlon sat by my fire through all of it, watching the parade of people who had never helped me, who had laughed at my grandmother, who had called us both crazy. His face was unreadable. They don't deserve it, you know, he said one evening after the Shivleys had come and gone. I was stacking wood by the door, ready for the next person who would need it. Maybe not, I said, but the wood doesn't know who burns it. It just burns. And I think that's the right way to be. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled, that sad old smile that always made him look younger. Your grandmother used to say something like that? She said, the mountain doesn't ask who needs water. It just gives. I think she learned it from the cave. I think she learned it before that, I said. I think she always knew. She just didn't have anyone to tell. The boys from the McDowell County home arrived on snowshoes in early February. There were 2 of them, older boys, 16 or 17, strong enough to make the trip. They carried empty packs on their backs and a note in Mrs. Parmenter's handwriting. The home is out of fuel. The children are cold. Any assistance would be appreciated. Not, please. Not, we're sorry for what we said. Just, any assistance would be appreciated, like she was filling out a form. I read the note twice. Then I folded it and put it in my pocket. Come with me, I said to the boys. I led them to the cave. I loaded their packs with as much wood as they could carry, 20 logs each, good dry oak that would burn hot and long. I sent them back with a pot of soup for the children and the message I'd been waiting 3 years to deliver. Tell Mrs. Parmenter this, I said. Tell her my grandmother would have wanted the children to be warm. They nodded and left. I watched them disappear down the mountain, 2 dark shapes against the white, carrying 40 logs between them. Harlon was standing in the doorway when I turned around. That was a kindness, he said. More than a kindness. It was what she would have done. Yes, but you're not her. You had a choice. He stopped, coughed, started again. She didn't have anyone who needed her. You do. You could have said no. I couldn't have, I said. That's what she taught me. That's what the cave taught me. You give what you have because having it isn't the point. Using it, that's the point. Sharing it, that's what makes it mean something. He didn't answer. Just nodded once, slowly, and went back inside. I stood in the snow for a while longer, looking at the cave entrance, thinking about my grandmother alone on this ridge for 31 years, thinking about all the people who'd laughed at her, all the neighbors who'd whispered about hellfire and witchcraft and deals with the devil. She'd never been able to prove them wrong. She died before the test came, before the winter that would show everyone what she'd built and why. But I was here, and the test had come, and now everyone knew. Mrs. Parmenter arrived in April after the roads opened up. She came in a wagon wearing her church dress, the good one, the one she wore to funerals and official functions. Her iron gray hair was pulled back tight, the way it always was, and her face was gray too, older than I remembered. Tired. She climbed down from the wagon and stood in my doorway. She didn't come inside. Miss Fosse, she said. I came too. She stopped, started again. Your grandmother wrote us a letter. I didn't say anything. 6 months before she died, asking if we had any Fosse children in our care, asking if she could. Her voice caught. If she could correspond with them. If she could perhaps take one in. I still didn't say anything. I knew what was coming. I'd known for 3 years, ever since I read that entry in the notebook. I wrote to the county home last summer, asking if there were any Fossey children. They never answered. I threw it away, Mrs. Parmenter said. I didn't read past the first line. An old woman on a ridge, writing to an orphanage. I thought she was mad. I thought it was a waste of time. She met my eyes for the first time. I didn't know she was your grandmother. I didn't know she was trying to find you. The weight of it settled on me. 6 months. If Mrs. Parmenter had answered that letter, I could have had 6 months with Marin Foss. I could have learned from her directly. I could have known her voice, her hands, her face, instead of just her handwriting. She wanted to teach someone, I said. My voice was steady. I was proud of that. She spent 31 years building something, and she wanted to pass it on. You took that from her. Yes? You took that from both of us. Yes. Mrs. Parmenter's face crumpled, not weeping, just sagging, like something inside her had collapsed. I'm sorry. I was wrong about her. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about everything. I stood there for a long moment looking at this woman who had controlled my life for 6 months, who had placed me with the pews, who had called my inheritance a 12-acre joke and said madness runs in families. She was old. She was tired. She was standing in front of me, asking for something I didn't have to give. I forgive you, I said. She looked up, surprised. Not because you deserve it, I continued, but because I do. Carrying anger is like hauling green wood. It weighs twice as much and gives half the heat. She didn't say anything. Tears were running down her face now, silent tears like she'd forgotten how to make a sound. Go home, Mrs. Parmenter. Take care of the children. And the next time an old woman writes you a letter from a ridge somewhere, read the whole thing before you throw it away. She nodded, climbed back into her wagon, drove away. I never saw her again. Harlon died on an October morning in 1925. I found him in his chair by the window, the one that looked out toward my ridge. His eyes were open, and his face was peaceful, and his one good hand rested on a piece of paper he'd been writing on. Bete. That was all it said. Whatever came next, he hadn't had time to write it. I closed his eyes. I wrapped him in his own quilt, the one his wife Emma had made, the one he'd kept on his bed for 30 years. I sat with him until dark, holding his hand, not saying anything because there was nothing left to say. They buried him next to Emma in the Bramwell Cemetery. I spoke at the graveside because no one else came. I told them about the man who had lost a hand to the mines, and a son to the war, and a wife to the sickness, and who'd spent his last years teaching a girl on a ridge how to survive. That spring, I planted a white oak sapling on his grave, the same wood that filled the cave, the same wood that had kept us both alive. He left me his cabin in a letter I found in his toolbox. He left me his tools. He left me a note that said, "You're the closest thing to family I had left. Make something good out of what's coming." I didn't know what he meant by that, not then. The years that followed passed quickly, the way years do when you're building something. I married in 1928. His name was Edwin Marsh, a timber cruiser who walked onto my property looking for survey markers and stayed for supper. He was quiet, like Harlon had been. He asked good questions and actually listened to the answers. He never once told me I couldn't do something, or shouldn't, or wouldn't. He just handed me tools and got out of my way. We had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. They grew up knowing the cave the way other children know their backyards, playing hide and seek among the wood racks, helping me stack and sort and cure. The system spread. By 1935, 3 families in the county had built cave storage systems based on my grandmother's design. By 1950, it was standard practice in the West Virginia highlands. Extension agents and agricultural students visited my cave for decades, taking notes, asking questions, studying what one woman had figured out alone on a ridge 60 years before. Dr. Poole's pamphlet was reprinted 4 times. Every edition credited Marin Fosse by name. Every edition told her story. The woman who saw what no one else saw, who built what no one else thought to build, who kept a secret for 31 years because the world wasn't ready to understand it. I worked the land until I was 74 years old. My hands knew the cave the way a pianist knows a keyboard. I could walk the 300 feet in complete darkness and find any chord by memory. Edwin died in 1971. I buried him on the ridge in a plot I'd picked out years before where you could see the cave entrance if you knew where to look. I planted a white oak sapling on his grave too. My children grew up and moved away, to cities, to coasts, to places where winters were mild and no one needed 40 cords of wood to survive. They came back for visits. They brought their children. The cave was always the first thing the grandchildren wanted to see. "Is it true?" they would ask. "Did great-great-grandmother really build all this by herself?" "She did," I would tell them, "and so did I. And someday, maybe one of you will too." I died on a Sunday morning in March of 1987. I was in the cave carrying a split log when my heart decided it was finished. I felt it stutter and stop, and I had just enough time to think, this is right. This is where I'm supposed to be. They found me that afternoon, my granddaughter, the one who lived closest, lying on the cave floor with my hand still touching the wood. The oak was dry and smooth and cool, the same as it had always been. She looked peaceful, my granddaughter told people later. She was exactly where she wanted to be. The County Historical Society put up a plaque on the cave wall in 1980. It's still there. The Foss Cave, developed by Marin Foss, 1842 to 1915, and Bet Foss Marsh, 1903 to 1987. A system of survival passed from one generation to the next. My grandmother never saw that plaque. She never saw her name carved in stone, never heard a professor call her work remarkable, never knew that the system she built would outlive her by 100 years and more. But I like to think she knows now. I like to think that wherever she is, she can see what came from those 14 notebooks, those 31 years of work, that one desperate letter to a county home that no one answered. Mrs. Parmenter said madness runs in families. Maybe it does. But so does stubbornness. So does vision. So does the ability to look at 12 acres of worthless rock and see a cave full of 40 cords of perfectly cured wood. They laughed because I had no woodpile. But I had learned the lesson the mountain teaches. The safest place to keep what you need is where no one thinks to look. That was what she wrote, 70 years old, alone on a ridge, hands shaking, eyes failing. And she was right. She was right about all of it. The safest place, where no one thinks to look. That's not deception. That's not madness. That's survival. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the people who laughed at you will come to your door with their hats in their hands, asking for help, and you'll get to decide whether to give it to them. I gave it. Every time. Because the wood doesn't know who burns it. So let me ask you something. What cave have you been standing outside of? What 12 acres of rock are you sitting on, telling yourself it's worthless because everyone else says so? What sealed entrance have you walked past 100 times without stopping to move the stones? Maybe it's a skill no one pays you for. Maybe it's an idea no one believes in. Maybe it's a piece of land, literal or metaphorical, that everyone else has written off as a joke. Who told you it was worthless? Who laughed when you talked about it? Who looked at you the way Mrs. Parmenter looked at me, with that expression that said, "I suppose madness runs in families?" Here's what I learned standing in that cave for 70 years. The people who laugh don't know anything you don't know. They just think they do. They look at the surface and see rock. They look at the entrance and see darkness. They don't have the patience to move the stones, to light the candle, to walk into the mountain and see what's waiting inside. But you do. You have the same thing my grandmother had, the same thing I had. You have the ability to see what's actually there instead of what everyone tells you is there. You have stubbornness, you have vision, you have hands that can move stones, even if they blister and bleed. The conditions don't have to be perfect. They almost never are. My grandmother started with $11 and a theory. I started with $2.35 and a broken pocket watch. We both built something that lasted. You can too. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think about your own sealed caves, your own worthless ridges, Your own voices that told you madness runs in families, then hit subscribe. Tell me in the comments what your cave is. Tell me what you're standing outside of. Tell me what stones you're finally ready to move. And then move them. Your cave is waiting. Everyone else has walked past it. They've told you it's nothing. Now you know better. Open the door.